Thank you. Thank you. Muchas gracias, Pastor Victor. I appreciate all the effort that you and your people have put into this effort of making today possible. Thank you very much. And to all of you here, I say buenos tardes, and you won't hear too much more Spanish from me. But I do know one phrase that I learned a few years ago. My wife and I have been in Costa Rica a number of times, and it's very hot there. And so one of the first phrases I learned is the following: Quisiera un té frío sin azúcar y con mucho hielo, por favor. So that much I know. It is a great privilege to finally be back in your beautiful country again after many years. I was in Madrid back in the 1980s at the U.S. Embassy, doing some work organizing meetings. And then again, more recently, just a few years ago, I was in Malaga, but just for a very short period of time. So this is my third time to Spain, but this time I was able to bring my wife Audrey with me. And we have been, in a few days, actually, later this month, we will have been married for 44 years. And we've been partners in our work together for over 30 years now. We have 4 married children, 9 grandchildren, and a 93-year-old father, a World War II survivor, who we are taking care of. And so between that and our regular day-to-day full-time work in our organization, we have very full lives. And it's not always that Audrey gets to come with me, but this time we thank the Lord that it was possible. Before getting started, I'd like to encourage you to write down our website information that you see up there. Our organization is called Hope for the World, and I've had the opportunity of writing 2 books. My first book, En Route to Global Occupation, has been translated into Spanish, and so you can obtain that by going to our website and going to the store there and looking for the Spanish version. My second book, and also our news journal that we publish regularly, our research journal, unfortunately is not available in Spanish, but those of you who can read English can get that there, and maybe you have friends who can translate that over into Spanish. But we cover behind-the-scenes global developments that you will not hear about through the mass media, especially as it pertains to globalization and global developments in the area of politics, economics, and also religion, and how those 3 areas interface. Just a little bit about my background. I am the son of European immigrants. I was born in the U.S. after my parents immigrated there in the 1950s. My father grew up in Croatia, and at the age of 12, the partisans were closing in. They ended up becoming the communists. And so my father and his family had about 1 day notice that they could stay and become part of that, or they needed to run for their lives. They chose the latter. So they formed a wagon train with some neighbors and relatives, and packed a couple of suitcases with some clothes and threw a few pots and pans in the back of the wagon, and they fled. They lost their farm, their house, everything they had. But they survived. Eventually, they ended up in the mountains of Austria, thinking that it would be safe there. It was in a remote area. But my father was placed in a boarding school for young boys, about 45, 50 kilometers from his house. And after a few weeks, he realized he wasn't learning a whole lot of math or anything else for that matter, but he was doing a lot of marching and other kinds of, it seemed like, military drills. Then one day he was walking down the hallway of the school, and the door to the headmaster's office was open a little bit. So he listened in, and he heard the headmaster speaking to the man who was second in command. And from that conversation, he discovered that these young boys, ages 12 to 16, were being prepared by the Nazis to be sent to the Eastern Front to fight the Russians. So my father thought to himself, I didn't come this far and flee from the communists to now have to go fight for the Nazis. So that night, he and his friend jumped out of a 2-story building and they ran for their lives. He was smart enough to know that he couldn't go straight to his house because they would be waiting for him. So he stayed in a barn and slept in the straw and the hay for a number of weeks. This was a 13-year-old boy doing this. So first he fled from the communists at age 12, and then from the Nazis at age 13. I'm sure there were other people also like that, but he's the only one I know who fled from both. After the war, his cousins and he, a few years later, went into Germany to get work. Their goal was to save up enough money so that they could then immigrate to the United States, where they had an uncle who was willing to sponsor them into the country. So that's what he did. He moved into a southern area of Germany, not far from the Swiss border, and there he met my mother. My mother grew up in a small farm village of 300 people. But they had one outspoken Nazi in the village, and he was the school teacher. And he kept an eye on the community. But my mother's father, my grandfather, was very outspoken against Hitler. So much so that neighbors said, Heinrich, if you don't shut up, you're going to get us all killed. But he kept speaking out, especially when he had a little bit of wine to drink. Then he would really tell you what he thought. So one day, 2 of Hitler's secret police showed up in town looking for my grandpa. But he was out in the fields working somewhere. So they went to the mayor's office. And the mayor was a friend of the family, fortunately. So he told a white lie. He said, last time I saw him, he went that way, to that other town. Which wasn't true. But as soon as they left and got out of sight, Then he tracked down my grandpa and he said, "You've got to get out of here, they're looking for you." And so he had to go into the forests and go into hiding for an extended period of time. And back in those days, they had wild pigs and wolves in those forests. So it wasn't safe, but God protected him. Eventually, my parents met. They got married and came to the U.S., where I was born. Growing up, I heard about these stories of what they went through during the war, especially at family gatherings where all the cousins were there as well. And so at an early age, I became fascinated with history. And by the age of 10 or 11, I remember watching the evening news with my father, which wasn't normal for a 10 or 11-year-old. But for me, I was interested in international affairs. Around the same time, right before I turned 11 years old, I accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And that, of course, had a huge impact on my life. And that following school year, in school, we learned some about history in World War II. And between what I learned there and what I already knew from my parents, I remember sitting in my classroom and I made a commitment to God. And I prayed silently, "Lord, if anything were to ever happen, again, like what happened during World War II, I promise to you I will take a stand, no matter the cost." And I meant that. But as an 11-year-old, you never really think that God is going to take you up on something like that. But He did. So now I'm going to fast forward over many years. By God's providence, I ended up getting an incredible job working for our state government of Indiana, which is just southeast of Chicago. And my title was Europe and Middle East Trade Specialist. And it was my job to help companies in our state to export their products in order to create more jobs in our state of Indiana. It was actually a political position. And so almost immediately I began traveling around the world. I was on the payroll of our state government. They're the ones who paid me for my job. But when I traveled overseas, my meetings were organized through our U.S. embassies and consulates, which of course is overseen by our federal government, and specifically the State Department, as it's called. Usually I would spend 2 to 4 days in each city, meeting with business leaders and working closely with people at the embassies. And I remember already during the first year on my job, I learned a lot about things going on within our government that disturbed me. Remember, this was back in the 1980s. And I discovered that the majority of people working within our embassies and consulates were globalists. I personally believe that if there was a crisis, They might have been more loyal to the United Nations
probablemente serían más leales a las Naciones Unidas
than to defending our U.S.
que no a
sovereignty
defender la
and our
soberanía de
Constitution.
los Estados Unidos y nuestra Constitución.
But what bothered me even
Lo
more
que me molestaba incluso más
was the fact that
era el hecho de
most of these
que la
people
mayoría de estas personas
were not very
no
fond
estaban
of Bible-believing
muy de acuerdo
Christians or
no,
Jews.
no estaban muy cómodos con los creyentes de la Biblia o con los judíos.
The Old and New Testament of the Bible, in other words, anything having to do with the Bible
Cualquier cosa que tuviera que ver con la Biblia
and a Judeo-Christian
y
worldview,
digamos la visión judeocristiana
they were not in line with that.
no están alineados con eso.
And I learned that
Yo
quite
aprendí
quickly.
eso bastante rápido.
During my 4 years in
Durante
that
mis 4 años en
position,
esa posición,
I met fewer than 10
encontré
Christians,
algunos de los 10 cristianos,
even though I traveled to, I believe it's 23 different
que
countries
viajé a 23 países diferentes
for our state
para
government.
nuestro gobierno del Estado.
Many of these people were agnostics
La mayoría de estas personas eran agnósticos
or
o
atheists,
ateos,
or maybe they had some Christian roots, but they had moved far
o
away
tenían
from
raíces
that.
cristianas, pero ya se habían movido lejos de eso.
And they came from even other religions, some Hindu, Buddhist,
Hindúes, budistas,
and it was a mishmash
y era
of
como
all
una
the world's
mezcla de
religions,
todas las religiones del mundo.
but only a handful of
Pero
Christians.
solo un puñado de cristianos.
So you can imagine, if you put yourself in my
Así que
shoes,
imaginaos, si os ponéis en mis zapatos,
with my background
con mi trasfondo,
and what my parents went through during World War II,
vivieron durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial,
I was sensitized to these kinds of things. I could see that this was not good.
este tipo de cosas. Podía ver que esto no era bueno.
And I thought, if this trend continues,
Si esta tendencia continúa,
one day some very bad things would be
un
happening
día unas cosas muy malas estarían
within the United States and even the world as a whole.
el mundo entero.
I rarely shared where I was coming from,
Compartía de dónde yo venía.
because if I would have told them I am a Christian,
Que soy un cristiano,
then they become quiet.
entonces se silenciarían, se
And
quedarían
so
callados.
I believe at this stage in my
Yo creo en este
life,
punto de mi vida,
my purpose
mi
was
propósito
to gather
era
information.
reunir información.
And it's amazing
Y
what
es
people will tell
impresionante
you
lo que la gente te contaría
if you ask certain questions
si les haces determinadas preguntas
and just listen.
y solo escuchas.
Well, to make a long story shorter,
Para cortar la historia,
eventually
eventualmente
I was actually invited
yo fui invitado
to join two
a
organizations
unirme a dos organizaciones
that were part of this
que eran
agenda
parte de esta agenda
to ultimately bring about a world government,
traer un gobierno mundial,
one government over the entire
un
world.
gobierno mundial para gobernar a todo el mundo.
One of these organizations was within our government.
Dentro de nuestro gobierno,
It was in the area of emergency management.
en el área de, digamos, de manejo de emergencias.
I was brought in as a volunteer. They recruited me.
Voluntario que me reclutaron.
And at first I thought it was a good organization. But then soon I learned otherwise.
Me di cuenta de que era otra cosa.
At our meetings, we were regularly briefed
Regularmente informados
by people who were well-known globalists.
que eran bien conocidos como globalistas.
I was in this organization for 7 years.
Durante 7 años,
The last 3 years, I had secret clearance.
digamos, información totalmente despejada.
And so I don't talk much about this
Así
publicly,
que no hablo mucho sobre esto públicamente,
but only to say those 7 years of experience that I had
así que solo puedo decir que esos 7 años de experiencia que tuve
helped me to
me
connect
ayudó
the
para
dots,
conectar las piezas, porque
to
esos
know
3 años he tenido acceso a información
who the
secreta
top
que no
globalists
podía
were and what they were doing and how they
identificar
operated.
quiénes son los globalistas y para quién están trabajando y cómo lo operan.
And I was very thankful for that experience.
Estuve muy agradecido por esa experiencia.
I believe God put
Creo
me
que Dios
there
me puso
for a
ahí
reason,
por
for
una
a
razón,
time.
para un tiempo.
The second
La
organization
segunda organización
that I was invited to
en la
join,
que se me invitó a unirme,
this was not part of
no
our
era parte
government,
de nuestro gobierno.
although there are some former government people
Hay personas que han
who belonged
pertenecido al
to
gobierno
this
que
organization.
pertenecen a esta organización.
And the name of this
Y el nombre de esta
organization
organización
was the World Constitution and Parliament Association.
Es la Asociación para el Parlamento y Constitución Mundial.
And you can see one of the letters that I received from
Puedes ver
them.
una de las cartas que recibí de ellos.
I received many letters. This one was from May of 1990.
Esta es de mayo de 1990, de las muchas cartas que recibí de ellos.
And you will notice from the title, it's quite blatant.
Es bastante claro.
It says World Constitution and Parliament Association.
Parlamento y Constitución Mundial.
This group was involved
Estaba involucrado
in drafting a world
un
constitution.
boceto, digamos, de una constitución mundial.
And they were also organizing
También están organizando
experimental meetings of a world parliament
de un parlamento global.
to be able to work through how it would eventually
Trabajar cómo
work.
eventualmente podrían trabajar.
I don't know if you can see it from your seats,
Podéis verlo desde vuestros asientos.
but the second name down from the
El
top
segundo nombre desde arriba,
on the left-hand side,
en el lado izquierdo,
actually the third name,
bueno, realmente el tercer nombre,
he is listed as a vice president of this organization,
vicepresidente de esta organización,
was Ramsey Clark.
era Ramsey Clark.
He was a former U.S. Attorney General
Él era un alto cargo del gobierno estadounidense
under President Jimmy Carter.
bajo el presidente de Jimmy Carter.
He was over our FBI.
Él estaba al cargo de nuestro FBI.
And this man was a vice president of this organization,
De esta organización,
working to bring about a world government.
para traer un gobierno mundial.
Also, Gerhard Havel of Germany,
También Gerhard Havel de Alemania
he was the president of the World Federalist Association.
era presidente de los federalistas mundiales, la Asociación de Federalistas Mundiales.
And this was a significant group.
Y este era un grupo significativo.
They wielded quite a bit of power and
Poseían
influence,
bastante poder e influencia
even with the United
dentro
Nations.
de las Naciones Unidas.
And on some of the other letters that I
Algunas de las
received,
cartas que recibí
they had other names
tenían
listed,
otros nombres listados,
also as vice
también
presidents.
como vicepresidentes.
One of them was Dr. Inamullah Khan
El doctor Inamul Khan
of
de
Pakistan.
Pakistán
He was the president of the World Muslim Congress.
era el presidente del Congreso Mundial de Musulmanes.
Also, Hans Peter Durr,
También Hans-Peter Durr
he was on the executive committee of Greenpeace,
estaba en el comité ejecutivo de Greenpeace,
which was heavily involved in
que
this.
estaba muy fuertemente involucrado en esto.
And as far as religions go,
Bueno, también hasta donde van las religiones,
Cynthia Waddell,
Cynthia Waddell,
who was the former president of the World Council of Churches,
el Consejo Mundial de Iglesias,
was involved in this
está
organization.
involucrada en esta organización.
Her name was on
Su
some of the
nombre estaba en
letterheads.
algunas de las cartas.
And there were also leaders representing Hinduism,
Representantes del hinduismo,
Buddhism,
budismo,
Catholicism,
catolicismo,
Protestantism.
protestantismo también.
They covered all the bases
Cubrían todas las bases.
because one of the goals behind this one world movement
Este gobierno, bueno, este movimiento de un
is to
movimiento
try to
global,
unify all of the world's
todas
religions.
las religiones del mundo.
If there's going to be a world government,
Un gobierno mundial,
somehow the religions of the world have to be brought together
que ser traídas y
for it to work.
para que funcione.
And they have put a lot of
Y han
effort,
puesto mucho esfuerzo,
the globalists have,
globalistas, lo han hecho
into
para
that effort.
que eso pueda suceder.
Also, just one more name worth
Un
pointing
nombre más
out
que merece la pena señalar
is Eagle Arvik.
es Igor Arvik.
Yes, he's right. If you look right there. And he was an honorary sponsor.
Él era un sponsor honorario.
And if the name sounds familiar,
Se suena familiar el nombre.
he was the chairman of the Nobel Prize Committee.
Era el directivo de los premios Nobel.
There were many Nobel Prize recipients who were part of this organization. There were many Nobel Prize recipients who were part of this organization.
Habían muchas personas que habían recibido premios Nobel que estaban dentro de esta organización, de esta asociación.
And I don't mean to say that all Nobel Prize winners are part of this. That's not the case. But there were many Nobel Prize winners in the organization. And so by winning the prize, it gives them a platform. And then in very subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways, some of these people are able to promote this agenda of world government.
agenda del gobierno mundial.
This organization,
Esta organización,
at the time I was in it for 4 years,
4 años,
I discovered that there were leaders from, I believe, over 200 different organizations who belonged to this one organization. So it was like spokes going out from the middle of a wheel. And these organizations represented millions of people around the world. But most of those people had no idea that their leaders were involved in this organization promoting these kinds of activities. The main purpose of this group, as I see it, was to create what would appear like a grassroots movement, so that one day when this goes public, it would appear to be non-threatening, something coming from the grassroots up. But there are also organizations working from the top down. There are literally dozens of globalist organizations collaborating together. Some of them working from the bottom up, others from the top down. This next document, is it coming up? Yeah. This was from April of 1991. This is something that they sent out to all the members at the time. And on the top right, it says, world government is required. And then world government requires a world constitution. And at the top of the left-hand column, it talks about the predicament of humanity, as they call it. It gives some of the reasons, some of the problems in the world for why we need to have a world government. In fact, they put out another document that gave 49 reasons for why we need a world government. Every problem you can imagine in the world, they say the answer to it is a world government. The big ones are the pursuit of world peace, to solve world hunger, to deal with the global economy. But the number one reason in that list of 49 reasons had to do with the environment, climate change, global warming. I became familiar with those terms at least 5 years before we heard of those publicly. Now, I believe we should be good stewards of the earth. I have no problem with that. My problem is how they are manipulating this issue for an ulterior motive and agenda, to deceive people into thinking we have to have a world government to solve this problem. Again, I received a copy of that list in the mid-1980s. And this didn't become a public matter until 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Some of you old enough might remember that. This next document, this was an advertisement that they gave to members, and we were supposed to pass this out to like-minded people, people who would be in favor of a world government. So it was promoting an event that would be held in Alexandria, Egypt, in late April and early May of 1991, to further this agenda. So this was back then. The top 3 leaders in this organization, who were the main organizers, I discovered also belonged to other organizations. One of those organizations was World Union.
La Unión Global.
World Union. I had never heard of that
Nunca había
organization,
escuchado de esa organización.
and so I did some research to look into it.
Investigación para mirarlo.
And I came to find out that World Union is a very
Y descubrí que
occultic,
la Unión
mystical
Global es una
organization
organización ocultista y mística.
that is sister
Que es
organizations
una organización que hay
with
organizaciones
world
hermanas,
goodwill.
que es buena voluntad mundial.
World Goodwill, which is headquartered in London and New York City.
En Londres y en la ciudad de Nueva York.
World Goodwill is a very occult New Age organization.
Es una organización de nueva era ocultista.
It was founded by a lady named Alice Bailey.
Alice Bailey.
Alice Bailey also founded Lucifer Publishing Company
La editorial o publicaciones Lucifer.
in 1922.
Publicaciones Lucifer en 1992.
You can't make this stuff up.
En
1922.
1922.
Yeah, you can't make this stuff up. It's almost unbelievable.
No puedes inventarte esto, es que es prácticamente increíble.
2 years later,
2 años después,
she changed the name
ella cambió el nombre
to Lucis
a
Trust.
Lucis Trust.
That organization still exists
Aún
today
existe hoy
and is very influential within the United Nations.
dentro de las Naciones Unidas.
A friend of mine who attended a meeting at the UN
Asistió a una reunión en las Naciones Unidas.
said that their literature was being distributed
Se estaba distribuyendo
at the meeting
en la reunión.
with the knowledge of the UN Secretary General at that time.
El secretario general en aquel momento de la ONU.
In addition, this might be a good place to point out something else.
Un buen momento para señalar otra cosa.
Alice Bailey
Alice Bailey
wrote many books.
escribió muchos libros.
She would go into a special room
Ella iría-
at her house,
entraría en una habitación especial
go
en
into
su
an
casa,
altered state of consciousness,
entraría en un estado alterado de conciencia,
an occult trance,
en un trance oculto.
and then her spirit guide
Ocultismo y su
would dictate to her, and she would just write everything.
Ella simplemente escribiría
And after
todo.
2 or 3 days,
3 días,
she would come out of the room with the manuscript completely finished,
con el manuscrito totalmente terminado.
sometimes 300 or 400 pages long.
Como 300 o 400 páginas de largo.
This was according to her
Eso
husband.
acorde a su- de acuerdo con su marido.
His name was Foster Bailey.
Su nombre era Foster Bailey.
Both Alice Bailey and
Ambos,
Foster
Alice
Bailey
y Foster Bailey
were heavily involved in Freemasonry
estaban altamente involucrados con la francmasonería
and the secret
y las
societies.
sociedades secretas.
Alice Bailey was
Alice
part
Bailey
of
era
what
parte
is
de
known
lo que se
as
conoce como
co-masonry,
la comasonería,
which is the women's
que
Masonic
era
movement.
el movimiento masónico de mujeres.
And Foster was heavily
Foster
involved
estaba involucrado
in the higher levels of
en
Freemasonry.
los niveles, los grados altos de la francmasonería.
So you have to
Así que tienes que
understand
entender
this is all
que
much
esto es
bigger
mucho más grande
than the World Constitution and Parliament
de
Association.
la Asociación de la Constitución y Parlamento Mundial.
There are many different groups and secret
Varios
societies
grupos de sociedades secretas.
that all play different
Todos
roles
están jugando diferentes
in this
papeles
overall
en este
movement.
movimiento total de globalización.
The upper tier globalists
Digamos que la parte arriba de los altos
in these New Age
globalistas,
organizations,
estas organizaciones
I
de
found,
nueva era, encontré,
as I already mentioned,
como ya mencioné,
were consistently opposed to
que estaban consistentemente
and spiteful
en contra
towards anything having to do with biblical
en contra de
beliefs.
cualquier cosa que tuviera que ver con creencias bíblicas.
So, what do these globalists actually believe?
¿Qué creen estos globalistas realmente?
Well, first, I'll talk about the lower and the mid level tiers.
Digamos que los niveles bajos y medios.
In the lower or mid level tiers of the globalist New Age movement, the dominant religious views
Las visiones dominantes religiosas
are closely aligned with pantheism
están muy cercanamente alineados con el panteísmo
and earth centric nature worship.
y digamos que la tierra como el centro de adoración a la naturaleza.
Many of these people believe something like this.
Estas personas creen algo como esto.
They believe that God
Creen
is
que
a
Dios
force
es una fuerza
and that this force
y que esta fuerza
exists in all living
existe
things,
en todas las cosas vivientes,
plants, animals,
plantas, animales,
and human beings.
y humanos.
And if you take the sum total
Y que si tomas la suma total
of all living
de
matter,
todas la materia, digamos, viviente,
you have what is God.
tienes lo que es Dios.
So, in their
Así que
view,
en su visión,
we are all part of
nosotros
God.
todos somos parte de Dios.
We're part of this
Somos
God
parte de
force.
esta fuerza de Dios.
And they believe
Y ellos creen
that if the world can
que si el
somehow be
mundo puede de alguna
unified
manera unificarse
under a world
bajo
system,
un sistema
that
mundial,
humanity
la humanidad
will take a quantum
entonces
leap
tomará como un salto cuántico
into a higher level
a
of
un escalón más
existence,
elevado de existencia.
and that we will
Y de
receive
que nosotros recibiríamos
supernatural occult powers
poderes ocultos sobrenaturales
to be able to
para
do
poder
things
hacer
that we could have
cosas
never
que
dreamed
nosotros
of
no
doing
podríamos
before.
haber soñado hacer antes.
That's what
Eso es
many of these
lo
people
que
believe.
muchas personas de allí creen.
They don't necessarily know about or worship Lucifer, but they are nevertheless involved
Adoran a
in
Lucifer,
occultic beliefs.
pero están menos involucrados en creencias ocultistas.
At the higher levels of the One
Los
World movement,
niveles altos de-
the real
de-
movers and
de
shakers
mundial,
are directly involved
los
in
agitadores y los
Luciferianism.
movimientos, los que lo promueven, están involucrados en movimientos luciferinos.
They actually worship Lucifer,
Realmente adoran a Lucifer.
the source of these false teachings.
Lo que es el origen de estas enseñanzas falsas.
They go that final step.
Ellos van a ese paso final.
They believe that Lucifer is the God of
Es el
light,
Dios de la luz.
and that Adonai,
Adonai,
the God of Christians
el
and
Dios
Old
de
Testament
los
Jews,
cristianos y de los del Antiguo Testamento de los judíos,
that he is the God of
es el
darkness.
Dios de la oscuridad.
And they believe that Lucifer
Lucifer
is warring against
está luchando
Adonai
contra Adonai
on behalf of the people of the
de parte de
world,
las personas del mundo,
to liberate
para
mankind
liberar a la humanidad
from the bondage that Adonai has placed
la
humanity
sujeción
under,
que Adonai ha puesto sobre la humanidad,
with the rules for living and guidelines
con
for
las,
living.
Reglas para vivir y las, digamos, las pautas.
So this is a kind of liberation
Esto es una
theology.
especie de liberación, una teología de liberación.
It turns the truth upside down.
Coge la verdad y le da la vuelta.
So if you wonder
Así que si os preguntáis
why our
por qué
world
nuestro mundo
seems to be racing toward lawlessness,
está acercándose a un entorno
now you
secreto,
understand
ahora
why.
podéis comprender por qué.
People have been moving away from the truth of the gospel
Alejándose de la verdad del evangelio,
and instead embracing a
en vez de
Luciferic
eso han estado
satanic lie.
agarrando un engaño satánico y luciferino.
You see, Lucifer, Satan,
Satanás
wants to receive the worship of
quiere recibir la
man.
adoración del hombre.
He longs to be
Él
worshipped.
espera, anhela ser adorado.
During the temptation of
Durante
Jesus,
la tentación de Jesús,
he even tried to get Jesus to worship
intentó
him.
conseguir que Jesús le adorara.
He's a very arrogant being.
Es un ser muy arrogante.
Let's take a look at Revelation chapter
Vamos a
13.
ver un momento Apocalipsis capítulo 13.
I'd like to read a few verses beginning in verse 2
Leer unos versículos, empezando por el versículo 2.
to see what the Bible has to say
Lo que la Biblia tiene que decir
about this kind of end time global scenario that I'm speaking of.
sobre esta figura, digamos.
I'm going to begin in the second half of verse 2. And whenever dragon, the word dragon is mentioned in Scripture, it's a symbolic reference to Satan.
Vale, voy a empezar por el versículo 2 y cuando en algún momento en la Biblia se hace referencia al dragón, se está refiriendo a Satanás.
Revelation chapter 13, verse 2b, second half of verse 2. It says,
Dice,
"The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was astonished and followed the beast. Men worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshiped the beast. And they asked, 'Who is like the beast? Who can make war against him?' The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise his authority for 42 months. He opened his mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. He was given power to make war against the saints and to conquer them. And he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast. That is, all whose names have not been written in the book of life belonging to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. People often ask me, where is world government talked about in the Bible? It is not mentioned by that name, but it is described in chapter 13 of Revelation. What is described right here is an end times global political system that will use its economic and military power to enforce a type of religious worship. Ultimately, this system will use its economic and political global influence to force people into a certain type of worship. And it will not be the worship of the true God. Rather, it will be satanic in nature. I believe that one more major global conflict may be needed to set the stage for ushering in the Antichrist and this satanic world system. Think about it. Follow me through on this. World War I was fought. After World War I, the League of Nations was established to lead the world toward world peace. It was the first public step in the direction of a world system. Then World War II was fought. After World War II, what happened? The United Nations was established. This was the next step. The United Nations of today actually represents the infrastructure for a world government. But it does not have the power and authority that it seeks. So would it not make sense that if there is a third world war or major global conflict, that these forces will then attempt to bring about an all-out world government? And they will say, we have to have a world government to prevent nations from fighting against each other. Then we will finally have world peace. But what people won't realize is that all the power will now be concentrated in one place. And it will make it possible for the Antichrist to rule. This is the direction that things are heading in, and why the Bible gave us the prophecies warning us against this type of coming deception. Wicked men and women in high places have been contemplating such a crisis for many years. In a letter to the Italian revolutionary leader, Giuseppe Mazzini, dated August of 1871, Albert Pike, who was the leader of the Illuminist activities in the United States, and also the head of Scottish Rite Freemasonry at that time, described a distant final war, which he felt would be necessary to finally usher in the New World Order. According to Pike, this conflict between two future superpowers would be sparked by first igniting a crisis between Islam and Judaism. He went on to write, and I'm going to quote him now at length. He said, "We shall unleash the nihilists and the atheists, and we shall provoke a great social cataclysm, which in all its horror will show clearly to all nations the effect of absolute atheism, the origin of savagery, and of most bloody turmoil." then everywhere,
entonces
the people, forced to defend themselves against the world minority of revolutionaries,
la minoría mundial de
will
revolucionarios
exterminate those destroyers of civilization.
destructores de la civilización.
And the multitudes,
Y la multitud,
disillusioned with Christianity, whose deistic spirits will be from that moment on without direction and leadership,
sin brújula,
but anxious for an ideal,
ansiosos
but without knowledge where to send their adoration,
donde dirigir su adoración,
will receive the true light
la verdadera luz
through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer
pura de Lucifer,
brought finally out into public view,
a la luz pública.
a manifestation which will result from a general reactionary movement which will follow the destruction of Christianity and atheism, both conquered and exterminated at the same time. In other words, their tactic is to create so much chaos and make things so bad on the earth that people will be crying out for a solution, and they will step in with that solution. And it will be Luciferic in nature. But probably most people will not recognize the deception and will go along with it. Should such a crisis be permitted to occur, the amount of destruction would be staggering. Humanity would tremble for fear, believing that man is about to destroy himself. For even if, let's suppose, Russia or the United States were eliminated as military powers, over 30 countries would still have nuclear capacity. It would be a time of despair and mass confusion. Add to this the resulting chaos of global financial markets, and the economic turmoil would only contribute to the world's state of panic. Man would be disillusioned and searching for answers. Many would even blame God for the devastation, not even considering the fact that it was man's own wickedness and willingness to be deceived that brought this about. For one professing to provide the solutions, the time would be ripe. Yes, for someone professing to provide the solutions, to have all the answers, the time would be ripe. In my book, En Route to Global Occupation, I have a couple of additional quotes I would like to share with you. Just in case anyone here doubts what the true purpose of Freemasonry and the cooperative secret societies really is all about. I mentioned Albert Pike earlier. He was the leader of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. In his book, Morals and Dogma, on page 321, he wrote the following. He said, Lucifer, the light bearer, Lucifer, the son of the morning, is it he who bears the light? Doubt it not. In other words, he's saying, yes, he is the source of light. Another quote, this comes from Manly P. Hall, a highly decorated Freemason who is one of the top Masonic historians. And he lived, I think, until the 1950s or 60s. So this is a bit more recent. In his book, The Lost Keys of Freemasonry, on page 48, he mentions that if a Mason gets to a certain level, it says that he has learned the dynamo of living power. He has learned the mystery of his craft. And at that point, he says, quote, the seething energies of Lucifer are in his hands, and before he may step onward and upward, he must prove his ability to properly apply this energy. It actually gets into ritual Luciferic magic, where they have to prove their ability to manipulate this energy force. It's utterly demonic. This is straight from their books. I give page numbers and everything. But again, most people involved in this do not realize what they're ultimately involved in. Because on the surface, all of this looks so good. People doing good works and wanting to bring about world peace and solve the climate crisis, and on and on. On the surface, it all looks good. Let me move on now. Since I first became familiar with the World Constitution and Parliament Association, as well as these other globalist groups, over 30 years ago, this dark global agenda has greatly accelerated. It is moving forward much more rapidly now. Some of you who are old enough will remember around the year 1990 when President H.W. Bush of the United States began to openly mention the term the New World Order. At that time, many globalists saw that to mean that their time was soon coming to move forward with it. They understood that they could not keep all of this quiet indefinitely. The point in time would come where they would have to go public. If there is ever going to be a world government, at some point this has to go public. So they worked very hard during the 1990s, getting any final pieces in place as far as organizational structure goes. And their goal was to begin to go public in the year 2000. And that, in fact, happened. Beginning the last week of August in the year 2000, and lasting through the first week of September, there were 3 unprecedented meetings in New York City. The first meeting involved over 1,000 religious leaders from all around the world. They represented every religion of the world. The meeting was financed in large part by Ted Turner of CNN, with the favor of Mikhail Gorbachev. He favored it and promoted it. And at that meeting, it was a big step in the direction of trying to bring the world's religions together. The other meeting that was held only a week later was at the United Nations. And by the way, the religious meeting was also held at the United Nations. And the second meeting involved 160 of the world's heads of state and presidents of countries. There are only about 200 countries in the world. 160 of them had their top leaders at this meeting in New York at the UN to discuss globalization. They even had a separate room set aside with a table where documents and international treaties could be signed and ratified by these world leaders, all for the purpose of giving the UN more power and authority to move us in the direction of a world government. Very little was mentioned in the news about the purpose of that meeting. Around that same time, a third meeting took place,
Este tiempo una tercera reunión se tuvo,
also in New York.
también en Nueva York.
It involved the world's most influential
Trataba sobre
economic leaders,
involucrando a los más influenciales líderes económicos,
people from academia,
gente de la academia
and from the mass
y
media,
también de los medios de comunicación.
also for the purpose of
También
pushing a
con el propósito de
globalist
empujar
agenda.
una agenda globalista.
As far as I am aware,
Hasta donde yo sé,
this is the first
esta es
time
la primera
ever
vez nunca
that the top political,
los líderes
economic,
políticos,
and
económicos
religious
y
leaders
religiosos
all gathered
todos se reunieron
in one place
en un lugar
in such a short space of time
en un periodo tan corto de tiempo
to promote the same
para
agenda.
promocionar esta misma agenda.
Since that
Desde
time,
ese momento,
things have
las
accelerated,
cosas se han acelerado,
especially beginning in the year 2006. Those were the last 2 years of the Bush administration.
especialmente en el año 2006,
And then,
los últimos 2 años de la administración de Bush.
During the 8 years of
Después,
Barack
durante
Obama,
los 8 años de Barack Obama,
things really began to move more
las
quickly.
cosas empezaron a moverse mucho más rápido.
Then Trump came in,
Después entró Trump,
and there was some pause in
y
these
había
things
una pausa en estas cosas,
and some pushback
y
against
también
it.
un empuje en contra.
Then Biden
Después
came in,
Biden vino,
and our country
y
literally
nuestro país literalmente
has fallen apart.
se ha caído en pedazos.
Part of the agenda
Parte
was
de la
bringing
agenda era
somewhere between 12 million and 20 million illegal
unos
aliens
12
into the country.
12 y 20 millones de ilegales a nuestro país.
And we know that somewhere between 600,000 and 2 million of those people have criminal records. 5 to 10% of all the people that came in have criminal records. And so this has thrown the United States into chaos. Back to the United Nations. The World Health Assembly, which represents the leadership of the World Health Organization, met last May in Geneva to try to ratify a global pandemic treaty. They weren't quite able to get everything accomplished that they wanted, but last week it was announced that they are now ready to move forward. And in 3 weeks from now, at their meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, they are expected to ratify an international pandemic treaty that would give them much more power than what they had during the COVID-19 pandemic. But even if they don't have all the power that they want, it doesn't matter because there is a backup plan. You see, the United Nations Summit of the Future was held in New York on September 22nd and 23rd. It was in September of last year, 2 days. And during that time, our world leaders signed and ratified a document. It's called the Pact for the Future. It was done. In 5 minutes, it was over. It was rubber stamped. So clearly it was decided well in advance that this would go through. The purpose of this document was to pave the way for the UN Secretary General to be given dictator-like powers in the event of a UN-declared international emergency, which could include an economic crisis, a sudden pandemic, an act of terror or war, a cyber attack, or even an event from outer space. Their words. So almost anything could qualify as an emergency. Imagine if the power outage that you experienced a few days ago here in Spain and Portugal, if something like that took place on a bigger scale, global, then the UN Secretary General could declare an international emergency. and seize power.
y entonces tomar el poder.
And it is the UN
Y entonces es las
who
Naciones Unidas
determines
los que
what
determinan
constitutes an
qué
international
constituye
emergency.
una emergencia
It could be
nacional.
almost anything that
Puede
they
ser cualquier
designate as
cosa,
such.
si lo designan así.
This all means
Esto todo significa
that we are
que
potentially
estamos potencialmente
only one international crisis away
a una crisis internacional
from an all-out one world government being implemented.
de una implementación total de un gobierno mundial.
The stage is nearly set.
El escenario está casi ya preparado.
This was not the case 30 years
Esto
ago,
no era el caso unos 30 años atrás.
but now all the
Pero
pieces
ahora
are in
todas las
place.
piezas están en su lugar.
Their hard work has been
Su
done.
buen trabajo, su trabajo duro,
They just need a major world crisis and cooperation from the mass media
mundial
and other world
fuerte
leaders,
y que involucrar a todos los líderes mundiales y los medios de comunicación.
and they would be able
Y
to
entonces ya
bring this
podría
about.
traer esto.
Top globalists are pushing to
Los
pull off their
más
world
fuertes
government
están
scheme
intentando mover este engaño del
within the
gobierno
next
mundial
10
dentro
years.
de los próximos 10 años.
Yeah, within the next 10 years. I never set dates
Yo nunca pongo fechas
because it denies the God
porque
factor.
deniega el factor Dios.
God can intervene
Dios puede intervenir
and push things back.
y empujar las cosas hacia atrás.
I am just sharing with you
Yo
what
solo
these
comparto
people
con
are
vosotros
planning.
lo que estas personas están planificando.
I hope they don't
Yo espero
succeed.
que no lo consigan.
I hope we have a global Christian revival
Un reavivamiento
that people
cristiano
seek the
global,
truth
que las personas busquen la verdad
and come to know Christ.
y vengan a conocer a Cristo.
But overall, the momentum has been with the globalists.
Pero por encima de todo, el momento ha llegado para los globalistas.
So we'll see what happens.
Así que veremos qué sucede.
This much I know. Humanity is being set up for a
La
huge
humanidad está
deception.
preparada para un gran engaño.
Jesus warned us of
Jesús nos
unprecedented
advirtió
deception
sobre engaños
that will
sin
occur
precedentes que
just
ocurrirán
before his
justo
return.
antes de su regreso.
In Matthew chapter
Mateo
24,
24,
verses 23 to 25,
23 al 25,
Jesus cautioned. He said,
Jesús advirtió,
"At that time, if anyone says to you,
algunos dijeren,
Look,
mirad,
here is the
aquí está
Christ,
Cristo,
or there he is,
aquí está,
do not
no
believe
lo
it.
creáis.
For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I have told you ahead of time."
Ya os lo he dicho antes.
So we must be
Así que
prepared
debemos estar preparados
for the fact
para el hecho
that a big part of this end
de que
times
gran parte de
deception
este engaño del
may
fin de
take
los tiempos
place
puede tomar lugar
in the name of
en el
Christ.
nombre de Cristo.
It may take place in the name of Christ,
En el nombre de Cristo.
using His name
Su nombre
and the banner of
y
Christianity
la bandera
as a
de la
cover,
cristiandad como una cubierta,
but not actually being from God or of God.
pero no realmente proveniendo de Dios.
This would indeed be a huge deception,
Esto realmente sería un gran engaño
which would have prompted Jesus' warnings in Matthew 24.
que corroborarían los engaños, o sea, las advertencias, disculpad, de Jesús en Mateo 24.
And this brings me to some developments even taking place this week.
Trae a unos sucesos que se han tomado lugar esta semana.
Of course, not long ago,
Pues,
Pope
hace
Francis
poco,
died.
Hace poco el Papa Francisco ha fallecido.
Many people were unaware
Las personas
of all the activities he was involved in.
desconocen de todas las actividades en las que él está involucrado.
He projected himself to be very humble,
Ser muy humilde,
but he was very cunning and smart.
muy astuto e inteligente.
He was the first Jesuit
Era
pope.
el primer papa jesuita,
He was a very dedicated globalist.
era un dedicado globalista.
He was the keynote speaker at the World Government Summit in Dubai.
Él era la nota clave del summit global de Abu Dhabi.
I believe twice, for sure once, but I believe twice.
De seguro uno, pero creo que dos.
And this summit was actually called the World Government Summit. Yeah, this meeting was actually called the World Government Summit. That's its actual name.
Esta reunión que se tuvo realmente se llamaba el Summit para el Gobierno Mundial.
That's how blatant this is now and how confident these people are.
Flagrante es esto y lo confiados que están estas personas.
Pope Francis also had very close ties to the World Economic Forum.
Cerca ligado al Foro Económico Mundial.
He regularly sent representatives
Enviaba representantes
to meet with the leaders of that organization. Now it's interesting
Ahora es interesante
that on the same day that
que
the
en el
Pope
mismo día que el
died,
Papa muere,
Klaus Schwab,
Klaus Schwab,
the leader of the World
el
Economic
líder
Forum,
del Foro Económico Mundial,
stepped down,
él se retira
retiring.
de su puesto, de su cargo.
And he appointed Peter Brabeck as the new leader.
Puso a Peter Brodbeck como el nuevo líder.
He is a leading Austrian businessman
Él es un hombre de negocios, líder austriaco,
and the former CEO of the Nestle Corporation.
y él era anteriormente el ejecutivo de la corporación Nestlé.
He's a very committed and devoted
Es
globalist.
un globalista muy comprometido.
So I don't believe much will change
No creo que
within the
cambie
World
mucho
Economic Forum.
dentro del Foro Económico Mundial.
And I'm sure the Vatican will retain close ties to that organization.
El Vaticano se mantendrá muy cerca de esa
They have had an enormous influence in preparing the world
preparar el mundo
for a one world economic system.
un sistema económico mundial.
Pope Francis also personally launched the Global Compact on Education.
El compacto global, el pacto global de la educación.
This was his idea,
Esa era su idea.
and the Global Compact on
Y el pacto
Education
global de la educación
was intended to further prepare the world's population for acceptance of the New World Order.
para la aceptación del nuevo orden mundial.
He actually came out and said as much.
Salió y dijo esto.
He believed that many people in the world needed to be further educated and prepared
Educados y preparados
before they would embrace the coming New World Order.
poder abrazar este nuevo orden mundial que se avecina.
He was also a strong advocate of the climate change agenda,
Un apoyador fuerte de la agenda climática,
which is at the core of the global government
es el
agenda.
núcleo de la agenda globalista del gobierno mundial.
In addition,
En adición,
he had very strong socialist leanings,
tenía también
tendencies.
tenía tendencias muy fuertes socialistas y globalistas.
It is not unfair to say that he really was a
Y
socialist.
no es injusto decir que realmente él era un socialista.
He was also an interfaithist.
Un hombre interreligioso.
He oversaw the establishment of the Abrahamic House of Faith in Abu Dhabi.
Él supervisó el establecimiento de las religiones abrahámicas en Abu Dhabi.
He oversaw the construction of that complex together with an Islamic imam named Ahmed al-Taib.
Había una construcción que se ha hecho que él supervisó con este imam
Ahmed al-Taib,
Ahmed al-Tayyib,
who is the leading Islamic cleric from Egypt.
que es el clérigo líder de Egipto.
And the two of them completely endorsed this.
Se involucraron en esto.
And in this
Y en
complex,
este complejo
there is an Islamic mosque,
hay una mezquita islámica,
a Jewish synagogue,
hay una sinagoga judía
and a Christian church,
y una iglesia cristiana.
and a special meeting area like a
Hay una
convention
especial
center
como un centro de convenciones,
where interfaith gatherings from around the world can take place.
conferencias donde ahí pueden tener reuniones interreligiosas de todo el mundo.
And this has been part of the Pope's efforts to bring all the world's religions together. He also strongly supported President Biden in the United States, who interestingly had taken a very strong pro-abortion position. So the Pope, even though he said he's against abortion, he consistently supported politicians in the United States who were very supportive of abortion. He was also very soft on many of the moral values issues. And he supported extreme COVID-19 lockdown measures. If the Pope would have stood up and said, no, we're not going to go along with all these shutdowns, then many other leaders around the world might have been bold enough to step up too. But he completely supported this agenda of control. It was a big global experiment to see how people would respond. I ask you, would Jesus have done any of these things? No. Now the question is, who will the next pope be? Now we know that any of the cardinals who are over the age of 80 are not permitted to vote on who the next pope will be. Only those cardinals under the age of 80 can vote. And it is a fact that Pope Francis appointed the vast majority of those cardinals who will be voting on the next pope. So I don't expect any major changes. Regardless of perhaps what the new pope will say publicly, privately, he will be installed by the same people who supported Francis. So we can expect more of the same. As I wrap up, while it is very much true that our adversary, Satan, has a sinister plan for the world, the great news is that our God, the Ancient of Days, also has a plan, and He will have the final say. One of my favorite passages in the New Testament is found in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 8. Paul wrote, "And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will overthrow with the breath of His mouth and destroy by the splendor of His coming." He will overthrow him by the breath of His mouth and destroy him by the splendor of His coming. So it won't even be a contest. In the end, Jesus wins. Hallelujah. Between now and then, however, we need to put on the full armor of God and fight the good fight of the faith that has been set before us. We need to stand firm for Jesus no matter what. Even if we would have to lay our lives down, it would be worth it, because we know we will spend eternity with the God of heaven and earth. We as Christians must take a stand against evil and against deception. If we don't, who will? If I, working for our government, would have remained quiet, then how could I expect anyone else to take a stand? We cannot cower in fear, but we have to be bold and courageous. Having said that, we must also communicate as much as possible in a spirit of love and tactfulness in order to reach people that need to hear this. But God has not given us a spirit of fear. He's given us a spirit of power, of love, and of a sound mind. And He expects us to use what He has given us to boldly declare the truth and His message of salvation. So thank you very much for your time. And I'm going to hand it over to Pastor Victor.
¿Qué piensa de la continuación de este proceso en Estados Unidos con el presidente Trump?
What do you think of this continuation of the process in the United States with Donald Trump?
Y en concreto, la Organización Mundial de la Salud sabe que España ha firmado el acuerdo antipandemia, así que nos van a vacunar por la fuerza. En Estados Unidos, por suerte, no.
And also about the pandemic treaty, Spain has signed that they can enforce vaccinations, but apparently the US hasn't signed this.
Correct. The World Health Organization, one of President Trump's first actions was to pull us out of the World Health Organization. So the U.S. is no longer funding that organization. And the U.S. was the number one funder,
Era el primer número uno fundador, digamos, de financiador,
but those funds have been cut off
pero
now.
esas financiaciones se han cortado.
So that is a good step.
Así que bueno, eso es un buen paso.
Also, he has been working to secure our border
También ha estado trabajando para asegurar nuestra frontera
and has done a good job on that as well.
y ha hecho un buen trabajo en eso también.
On the global economy,
En la economía global
I am concerned.
estoy preocupado.
Hopefully,
Espero
the tariff situation
la situación de terror
will soon be settled,
pronto se asentará.
because I personally believe
Porque yo personalmente creo
if all the countries of the world
que todos los países del mundo
stood together with China
están firmes con China
and did not move on the tariffs,
y on the tariffs.
regarding the tariffs, if everything stayed as it is right now,
Los aranceles. Gracias. Se refiere a los aranceles. Si se mantuvieran firmes con los aranceles,
potentially within 6 months or so,
realmente durante 6 meses o así,
it could collapse the whole global
podría
economy.
colapsar toda la economía global.
And that would create exactly the kind of
Exactamente
crisis
el tipo de crisis
that the globalists
que los
want
globalistas quieren
to try to
para
introduce
intentar introducir
a new world economic
un
system.
nuevo sistema económico mundial.
So that's my
Así que
concern.
eso es mi preocupación.
But I also
Pero también
understand
entiendo,
in the U.S.,
en los Estados Unidos
people have been quite
los
upset
han estado bastante
for a long
frustrados
time
por mucho tiempo,
because some countries
porque algunos países
have had tariffs on our
han
products
tenido aranceles en nuestros productos
that are over 100%.
que están por encima del 100%.
Even Canada, our close neighbor,
Que es nuestro vecino cercano,
had one tariff that was over 100%
más de 100%,
and another tariff even higher than that.
arancel incluso más alto que ese.
And so it's not right and fair.
Así que no está muy bien ni justo.
And something else that
Algo
is
más que
not right.
no está bien.
The money that the U.S. is
Dinero que
giving
los
out
Estados Unidos está dando
around the world
por el mundo,
to countries all over the
a
place,
países por todas partes del mundo,
the U.S. does not have that
Estados Unidos
money.
no tienen ese dinero.
It's all borrowed
Todo
money.
es prestado.
So the U.S. is borrowing money
Los Estados Unidos están
that it's then giving out
pidiendo
all over the
prestado
place.
dinero que luego están dando por todas partes.
And we now have $37 trillion of debt. If you add up all the debt in the United
Si
States,
añades, lo sumas toda la deuda de los Estados Unidos,
federal, state,
federal,
local,
estatal y
It-
local,
it would be close to $500,000 for every baby that is born into the United States.
sería como medio millón de dólares por cada bebé que nació en los Estados Unidos.
We're very close
Estamos
to,
muy cerca.
so it appears that Trump is doing what he can, but
Parece que Trump está haciendo lo que puede.
I can only hope that it ends well.
Solo puedo esperar que acabe bien.
Una pregunta más. Allí al fondo.
Hola, buenas. Gracias por la conferencia.
Hello, thank you for the conference.
Muy interesante, la verdad.
Very interesting.
Yo tengo una pregunta.
I have a question.
He estado leyendo tu libro
I've been reading your book this week,
y le he estado dando información a la inteligencia artificial
and
sobre
I've
tu libro.
been
a
given,
ChatGPT.
I have been given giving information to the artificial intelligence ChatGPT about your book.
En un momento dado, ChatGPT colapsó por la información que le estaba dando
And at one point, the ChatGPT collapsed because of the amount of information she was giving.
y se sorprendía por todo lo que le estaba dando del libro. Mi
And
pregunta es,
my question is,
con la tecnología que hay ahora y con lo que tú escribiste en 1987,
with the technology that there is now and what you wrote in 1987,
¿te intentaron censurar el libro?
did they try to censor your book to?
Porque denuncias directamente a altos grados
Because
de
you
la ONU,
you denounce directly high grades of people in the UN and or what has happened in your life.
Yeah, my book actually came out right at the end of 1991, early 92. And I have to go into some detail here. My publisher initially wanted me to use a different name that was not my own for my safety purposes, because the previous author who they published about 1 year earlier was killed.
Fue asesinado.
He exposed the highest levels of the New Age movement.
Los niveles altos del movimiento de la nueva era.
And his car plunged off of a cliff in Colorado.
Y en Colorado su coche pues se estrepitó por un acantilado.
They believed it was a criminal act, but they couldn't prove who did it.
Creyeron que era un acto criminal, pero no probaron quién fue.
And so to protect
Así
me,
que para protegerme,
they recommended that I use a different name.
un alias, ¿no? Diferente nombre.
So they assigned me a name
Que me
for a
asignaron un
while.
nombre.
But then right before my book
Justo antes
came
de que
out,
el libro saliera,
they said, on second thought,
pensándolo en segunda vez,
maybe the best protection
la
for
mejor
you
protección para ti,
would be if you come out with your real name,
si salieras con tu nombre verdadero,
but we will put you on many talk shows very quickly
pero te pondremos en muchos programas de charlas muy rápidamente.
before the adversaries
Los adversarios
know even what happened.
supieran, ni siquiera lo que había sucedido.
And so that's what they did.
Eso es lo que hicieron.
So during the first 2 months
Los primeros 2 meses
after my book came out,
que mi libro saliera,
I was on approximately 40 talk shows,
unos 40 programas de
Uh,
charlas.
mostly radio, but also some television.
Radio, pero también, mostly radio, but
Mostly radio, but also some television.
mayormente radio, pero algo también de televisión.
Also, around that time, a pastor in the U.S., Pastor Chuck Smith,
Y también por aquel tiempo un pastor estadounidense, Chuck Smith,
who was with the Calvary Chapel churches,
estaba con una
Calvary-
que se llama Calvary Chapel.
he openly endorsed my book from the pulpit and spoke about it in his church.
Él habló desde el púlpito de su libro en su iglesia.
And that really helped get the
Y
message
eso
out
realmente
quickly.
ayudó a esparcir el mensaje muy rápido.
But then the attacks
Pero
started.
luego vinieron
And in my first book,
y bueno, en mi primer libro
I published the telephone number of the World Constitution and Parliament Association.
publicó el número de teléfono de la Asociación de la Constitución y Parlamento Mundial.
And I encouraged people to call them
Y digamos que invito a la gente o incito a la gente a que les llamen por teléfono.
and tell them that they are opposed to their agenda.
Digan que están en contra de su agenda.
So they began getting hundreds of phone
Empezaron a
calls.
recibir cientos de llamadas.
They were, needless to say, very upset with me.
No hace falta decir que estaban muy molestos conmigo.
But they or any of their affiliated
Ellos o
organizations
cualquier organizaciones afiliadas
would have done something
hubieran
to
hecho
me
algo contra mí,
that everybody would have
entonces todo el
known
mundo sabría
they're the ones who
que
did it.
son los que lo hicieron.
And so I do
Así
believe
que sí creo
that God used
Dios
the strategy that we
esa
had
estrategia que teníamos
as a type of protection.
como una.
But since that
Pero
time,
desde ese momento
I have gotten
sí he tenido
direct threats on numerous occasions.
directas en varias ocasiones.
Not recently,
No recientemente,
but 5 months after
5 meses después
9/11 took place in New
de
York.
septiembre, del 11 de septiembre
So this would have been January of
del
2002.
a enero de 2002, nos llamó un día.
And he said, "Have you checked your website
¿Has
recently?" I
revisado tu página web últimamente?
said, "No, not in the last few days."
No, en los últimos días.
He said, "You might want to look at it."
Quizá deberías de chequearlo.
So we went to our homepage,
Nuestra página web.
and our website had been completely destroyed.
Nuestra página había sido totalmente destruida.
And they said, "We have destroyed your website because of the things you are speaking out
Que
against."
habéis estado hablando en contra de.
And then an hour or so later,
Y bueno, una hora o así después,
another message went up,
otro mensaje.
and this was a direct death threat against me,
Era una
against my
amenaza
life.
directa de muerte.
So we brought the local police in to document this and to show it.
Documentarlo y mostrarlo.
And on 2 other occasions, our cars were tampered with.
Coches fueron manipulados.
One time,
Una vez
I was about 2 kilometers from our house.
estaba a 2 kilómetros así de mi
I was
casa.
stopped at a red light,
Se me paró. O sea,
and when I
yo
took off from the red light,
estaba parado en un semáforo en rojo.
all of
y
a sudden I
después
had no
pasé el semáforo
steering,
rojo y de repente no tenía dirección.
no steering or control of the car.
No controlaba la dirección del coche. El
So
volante.
by God's grace,
Por la gracia de Dios,
I was only going maybe
estaba a unos
20 kilometers an
20
hour.
kilómetros por hora.
But 10 seconds later, I would have been going much faster, and it could have ended badly.
Mucho más rápido y podría podría haber acabado muy mal.
So we are always
Así que
careful,
siempre tenemos cuidado,
but not paranoid,
pero no paranoides.
and we pray for God's
Y oramos
protection,
por la protección de Dios.
and we keep speaking the truth
Y
as He gives us the
seguimos hablando la verdad
opportunity.
y
But we
damos la
would
oportunidad.
encourage your prayers for us.
Invitamos vuestras oraciones por nosotros.
There are people today
Hay personas hoy
who are actually in our political
que
system,
realmente están en nuestro sistema político,
who are very well known
que son
in
muy
political
conocidos
circles,
en los círculos políticos.
and some of them are strongly speaking out against this agenda
Están
now.
hablando fuertemente contra esta agenda.
So they have become bigger targets
Ellos
than
han
me.
vuelto, digamos, objetivos mayores. Que
Yeah. I'll say this yet.
Solo una cosa.
When my book first came out,
Salió mi libro por primera vez,
maybe 2% of Americans
2% de los americanos
had any idea
tenían
about these
alguna idea
things.
de lo que eran estas cosas.
Now I would say
Ahora podría decir
it might be 25 to
25
30%
o
of people.
30% de las personas.
So much ground has been
Así
gained.
que se ha ganado mucho terreno.
But the globalists
Pero
also
los
understand
globalistas también
that
sostienen que
time is running out for them.
el tiempo se les está acabando.
So they're pushing harder and harder to
Empujando
get
más
things
fuerte
done.
para que las cosas se hagan.
Yeah.
¿Sí?
Hola, gracias por la
Hello,
conferencia.
thank you for the conference.
Lo que me interesaría saber si nos puedes informar
What is
sobre
interesting to know is
estos
if you
grupos
can
de militares que les llaman los sombreros blancos.
inform a bit about these military groups that are called the White Hats.
Según tengo entendido, se formaron a partir del asesinato de Kennedy.
As long as I know, he's saying they were formed from the assassination of Kennedy, about from that time.
Yeah, I don't know the details of the history
Detalles de la historia
of the White Hats,
de los sombreros blancos.
but these two segments
Pero estos
of
dos segmentos
or groups of
o
hats,
grupos de sombreros,
I don't have a good feeling about it.
no tengo una buena sensación sobre ello.
I think there might be ulterior motives behind this,
Creo que habrían motivos ulteriores detrás de ello.
but I cannot speak with knowledge
Pero no
on
puedo
it
hablar con un conocimiento
because I am not satisfied
porque no
with
estoy satisfecho
the completeness of the research.
con, digamos, con la totalidad de la investigación.
And so it is something that we are watching.
Así que es algo que estamos observando.
Many of these kinds of things end up being rooted in the secret societies.
Muchas de esas cosas están arraigadas en las sociedades secretas.
Historically, that's been the case.
Históricamente
So
ha sido el caso, así que
I'm distrusting.
me mantengo desconfiado.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿Sí?
Hay preguntas desde el chat.
The live chat has some questions.
Preguntan, ¿habrá una única moneda global digital o serán varias monedas digitales?
Will there be only one global economy coin, or will there be different digital economy coins?
That's a good question.
Es una buena pregunta.
I think at the very least they will
Pienso que por lo menos
be merged into and monitored
se emergerán
by one system that will be appointed by the governing authorities.
para que será un sistema que monitoreará, será señalado para monitorear, todas estas economías, digamos, estas monedas.
Also, the Club of Rome, back around 1970,
Por 1970
they envisioned a world government
visionaron un gobierno mundial
based upon 10
basado sobre 10
political economic regions.
regiones políticas y económicas.
And they have been working toward
Están
that.
trabajando en favor de ello.
And the European Union was
Y
to
la
be
Unión
one of
Europea
those
debe ser
regions.
uno de esos poderes, esas regiones.
So there are some globalists
Así que hay algunos globalistas
that as the next step,
que para el próximo paso
they would actually like to see several different currencies
les gustaría ver diferentes monedas,
where the hundreds of currencies that now exist
las cientos diferentes monedas que
are
ahora
narrowed
existen,
down to a
se
few
reducen a solo unos pocos
within regions.
dentro de regiones.
And then those regions are merged together into one
Se fusionan, digamos, en una,
with eventually one currency.
finalmente con una moneda única.
But this was before cryptocurrencies
Pero
existed.
esto era antes de que se generaran las criptomonedas.
So things could go much more quickly now
Las cosas podrían irse mucho más rápido ahora
because of the global nature of the cryptocurrencies.
por la naturaleza globalista de las criptomonedas.
But here's what people aren't
Pero aquí
thinking
es lo
about.
que las personas no están pensando.
Some people say
Algunas personas
if we
dicen,
use cryptocurrency,
si usamos criptomonedas,
that's the way to go
es la manera de ir,
because it's private
porque es
and
privado
nobody
y nadie
knows what you have.
conoce lo que tienes,
But
pero
all the transactions have
todas
to
las
be done through the
transacciones
internet.
se tienen que hacer a través de internet.
So whoever controls the
Así que
internet,
quien controla el internet,
they could shut everything down tomorrow.
todo mañana.
You can't make a single transaction with cryptocurrency without the use of the internet.
El uso de internet.
So who controls the internet ultimately? And can they use that to control the cryptocurrency?
Para controlar las criptomonedas.
And I believe the answer is
Y
yes.
yo creo que la respuesta es que sí.
So I hate to see the world move away from a physical
Al
currency.
mundo moverse o alejarse de una moneda física.
As long as people have a paper
Mientras
currency,
las personas tengan una moneda en papel,
they have a measure of freedom.
tienen una medida o una parte de libertad.
If paper currency
Si
disappears,
la moneda en papel desaparece,
then people can be completely controlled through the
las
internet
personas podrían ser totalmente controladas a través del internet,
and through electronic currency.
a través de la moneda digital.
Siguiente.
Hay más preguntas.
There are more questions.
Hay más preguntas en el chat. Si da tiempo las vamos a ir.
Are you up to more questions?
I'll take a few more, yeah. If I don't know the answer, I'll just say no.
Si no sabe la respuesta, yo digo que no, simplemente ya está.
Preguntan qué poder sería como qué poder necesitan Naciones Unidas para el gobierno mundial o algo así.
What kind of power does the UN need for this global government?
Well, they would need emergency powers
Poderes de emergencia.
because if a significant amount of time passes
Si un
after a
tiempo
crisis,
significante pasa, un tiempo significativo, perdón, pasa,
then people might catch on to something not being right.
quizás las personas se den cuenta de que hay algo que no está yendo bien.
But if there is a major
Pero
crisis,
si hay una gran crisis,
the UN would have to act
las
very
Naciones Unidas
quickly
tendrían que actuar muy rápidamente,
with the element of
con
surprise.
el elemento de sorpresa.
And this would go through the UN Secretary General.
Iría a través del secretario general de las Naciones Unidas.
And then the various UN agencies would be empowered.
Diferentes agencias de la ONU estarían siendo empoderadas.
And because a pact for the future was signed,
Y como se firmó el pacto por el futuro,
that, for example, is more powerful. It is over the World Health
más
Organization.
poderoso y está por encima de la OMS, de la Organización Mundial
A
de
lot
la
of people don't realize the World Health Organization is under the auspices of the United Nations. So the UN would have full authority even over the World Health Organization. Now, what would happen
Ahora, ¿qué sucedería
if there was a war and New York City would be destroyed?
y la ciudad de Nueva York se destruyera?
Well, then clearly the seat for world government would move elsewhere.
Entonces, claramente, digamos que el asiento para el gobierno mundial se trasladaría a otro sitio.
And that cannot be ruled out as a possibility.
Y esto no se puede descartar como una posibilidad.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Otra pregunta. Nos preguntan por aquí. Dice, para que se concrete el gobierno mundial, ¿todos estarán marcados con el very chip?
¿Puedes repetir, perdona?
Para que se concrete el gobierno mundial, ¿todos estarán marcados con el very chip?
So that this world government can be arranged or done, will everyone be marked with the very chip?
It could happen either a chip or even an invisible laser tattoo.
Un tatuaje láser invisible.
I know in parts of the world
Conozco partes del mundo
there are purchases, buying and selling, already taking place through
y compraventas que ya se están haciendo
through an invisible
a través de
laser tattoo.
un tatuaje hecho por láser invisible.
It can be scanned very similar to at the grocery store, the universal product code, the way it's scanned,
Lo que es el código de barras universal que hay en las tiendas.
except it could be on the back of the hand.
Podría estar en el reverso de la mano.
But a chip is also a possibility.
Un chip también es una posibilidad.
The technology, for sure, it exists now.
La tecnología desde luego que existe ahora.
30 years ago when my book came out, it didn't,
Cuando mi libro salía, no.
but now it does
Pero ahora
exist.
sí.
Many people in the world,
Personas del mundo,
especially in the United States right now,
actualmente en los Estados Unidos ahora
would strongly resist such an effort.
resistirían muy fuertemente este esfuerzo.
And so I believe, at least in the United States, we are moving closer and closer to what might eventually be really a type of civil war.
Así que en los Estados Unidos creo que nos estamos moviendo cada vez más cerca hacia lo que sería una guerra civil.
Because if 30%
Si hay un 30%
of Americans say,
americanos que dicen,
I'm not going to do
"Yo
this
no voy a hacer esto
and take a stand,
y voy a mantenerme firme",
then it will be a big challenge to the government to try to force that on people.
Intentar obligar eso a las personas.
Thank you very much. Otra pregunta. Si
Another
vamos-
question?
One more, I'll take one.
Una más, la última.
Otra más. Bueno, pues. Bueno, hay varias, pero bueno, no sé, puedo elegir una. Aquí nos preguntan, la siguiente dice: ¿conoces nombres concretos de falsos cristos y falsos profetas actuales?
Do you know names, precise names of false Christs or false prophets today?
Well, there are many.
Hay muchos.
I-
varios.
I remember
Recuerdo,
10 years ago, so
más o menos,
I learned, to my surprise,
aprendí para mi sorpresa
that there were over 100 people
que había más de 100 personas
in the state of California
en
alone
California
claiming to be Jesus Christ
clamando ser Jesucristo,
or the Christ.
Cristo.
And part of their thinking is
Parte de su pensamiento,
they believe they are part of
ellos creen que son,
what New Agers call the Christ consciousness.
que son parte de lo que la gente de la nueva era creen como la conciencia crística.
So they believe they are a type of
Así que
Christ.
son un tipo de Cristo.
But in addition to that, on
Adición a eso,
a bigger
en
scale,
una escala más grande,
you have at the Vatican,
tienes en el Vaticano,
you have popes
tienes papas
who have taken on incredible authority
que han tomado autoridad increíble
over the world in the area of religion,
por encima y sobre todo
and
el
also
mundo,
involved
en el área de la
politically and
religión,
economically.
involucrados políticamente y económicamente.
And they are claiming to be the vicar of Christ on earth.
Y ellos llaman ser el vicario de Cristo.
Now, something interesting
Ahora, algo interesante,
I believe it was, I think in 1 John chapter 2,
creo que es en 1 de Juan capítulo 2,
it talks about the
habla
Antichrist,
del anticristo.
and the definition there,
La definición,
the meaning of
el
it,
significado,
can actually mean
realmente significa
someone who
alguien
presents
que
himself
se presenta a sí mismo
in the place of
en
Christ,
el lugar de Cristo.
in place of Christ.
En lugar de Cristo.
So I believe
Yo creo
that at the very least,
que por lo menos
the Pope of
el Papa
Roman Catholicism
de la Roma católica,
will endorse this one world agenda openly at some point.
que digamos que dominará toda esta agenda global en última instancia.
Because if he openly opposed it,
Porque si él se opusiera a ello,
it could never happen. It could never happen. This one world government could not
nunca
happen
sucedería si él se opusiera a ello.
if the Pope
Si
and
el Papa
all the cardinals
y
around
los
him
cardenales
and other church denominations would oppose
y
this,
todas las otras denominaciones de iglesias
the New World Order would not stand a chance.
fueran en contra, el nuevo orden mundial nunca no tendría posibilidad.
But so far that has not
Hasta
happened.
ahora eso no ha sucedido.
It's quite the opposite.
Es bastante lo contrario.
They have been supporting the New
Ellos
World
están
Order.
apoyando al nuevo orden mundial.
And so I have no reason to believe that it will be different in the
Que vaya
future.
a ser diferente en el futuro.
Puedo añadir que precisamente
I can add that precisely
hace un par de semanas
About 2 weeks
ha salido
ago,
un personaje
that someone
del
has
mundo
come
del
up
Islam que dice que es
from
el Mesías.
the world of Islam that he's saying that he is the Messiah.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Yo querría
Well,
hacer
thank you very much.
un comentario personal.
He would like to do a personal comment.
Desde que he empezado a escucharle,
Since I've started listening to you,
yo llevo 25 años en digamos, en este grupo
I've been 25 years in this group
con Víctor,
with Victor.
muchos años,
It's many years.
y ha sido impactante
And it has been
escucharle,
impacting to listen to you, to hear you.
porque ha sido un paralelismo muy grande
Because
con
you
todo lo que
explained
hemos estado explicando
A parallelism, a really big parallelism with what we have been explaining,
y promoviendo desde
and
hace 25 años.
promoting since, 25 years ago.
Es impresionante, la verdad
It's
es que estoy realmente emocionado de
impressive.
escuchar esto porque
I am-
apoya.
I am really emocionado. It's excited, yeah, to hear this.
Porque todo esto está apoyando todo lo que hemos presentado.
Because all of this is supporting everything that we have been presenting.
Praise the Lord.
Gracias por todo.
Thank you.
¿Alguna pregunta más? ¿Lo dejamos descansar?
Shall we let him rest, he's saying?